There clearly has been a deliberate buildup of tensions on the part of the Trump administration with the country of Venezuela. It has been a long time, very bipartisan goal to engineer regime change in Venezuela, both because Venezuela is part of the world that we consider to be our domain, our backyard. Ever since the Monroe Doctrine, we rule all of the hemisphere, and if there's a government we dislike, that government has to be removed. You may remember that for years, both parties in Washington indulged this absolutely delusional fantasy that the real president of Venezuela was not first Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro, who were actually in charge of governing Venezuela, but instead someone named Juan Guaido, who we just singled out, some very pro-US, pro-Western puppet. And we're like, he's the president of Venezuela, even though he never received any votes, and he came to Washington, and there was a State of the Union address, and Donald Trump introduced him as the legitimate president of Venezuela. And Nancy Pelosi jumped to her feet faster than you've ever seen her do, except when Benjamin Netanyahu speaks to the Congress, and began applauding and celebrating, all the Democrats, all the Republicans joining together. So regime change in Venezuela, very oil-rich Venezuela, just total coincidence, but it's worth noting, has been a long-time goal of both parties in Washington, but particularly of Marco Rubio. The way a lot of people who are Cuban and come to this country and live in Miami have with Latin America. They want the U.S. government to change the countries and transform the regimes throughout Latin America, the way many people want the U.S. to do in the Middle East with Israel, and other people want the U.S. to do with Ukraine. There's a huge political faction, very powerful in Florida, out of which Marco Rubio emerges, that wants the U.S. government to rule Latin America. Now that he's Secretary of State, it's his time to do so. And engineering regime change in Cuba and Venezuela probably are his two biggest dreams. And he's now in a position of power inside the U.S. government to do that. And it seems like the U.S. government is on its way. There were efforts actually in the first Trump administration to engineer regime change in Venezuela, led by John Bolton. And one of the reasons why Trump had a falling out with John Bolton and ended up firing him is because it didn't go nearly as quickly or as easily as Bolton suggested to Trump would happen. And in fact, Trump ended up with some sort of respect for Maduro, the way he has respect for what he considers to be tough guys, like tough leaders, strong men, as a result of Maduro's ability to stay in power, even despite the United States' best effort to remove him. But now these efforts seem to be really escalating. The U.S. has deployed major military assets off the coast of Venezuela, constant warships and aircraft carriers and submarines, clearly signaling to Caracas that the U.S. is seeking some kind of military conflict, or at least trying to have Maduro perceive the threat. And all of that escalated into something quite concrete yesterday when Donald Trump went on to Truth Social and made this announcement, quote, "Early this morning, on my orders, the U.S. military forces conducted a kinetic strike against positively identified Trinidad narco-terrorists in the Southcom area of responsibility. TDA is a designated foreign terrorist organization operating under the control of Nicolas Maduro, responsible for mass murder, drug trafficking, sex trafficking, and acts of violence and terror across the United States and Western Hemisphere. The strike occurred while the terrorists were at sea in international waters transporting illegal narcotics heading toward the United States. The strike resulted in 11 terrorists killed in action. No U.S. forces were harmed in this strike. Please let this serve as notice to anybody even thinking about bringing drugs into the United States of America. Beware. Thank you for your attention to this matter." Multiple exclamation points. And to melodramatize the event, Trump posted a video of this ship, obviously being surveilled by U.S. surveillance technology and then blown up. It's not a big ship, to put that mildly. It seems like you could carry an amount of cocaine on a ship like this, or a boat like this. Is not a ship at all. It's just like a speedboat that might, I don't know, have enough cocaine to fuel, say, like a big bachelor party or wedding party, like the Jeff Bezos wedding. I'm not saying there was cocaine used there, but if there were, seems like this might be the amount. You probably would actually need more. We're talking about a big amount here. They also claim there are 11 people on this small little boat, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would you pack a boat that you want to carry drugs with 11 people? The more people you have, the less space there is for the drug. But as you'll see, the United States military just zapped it out of existence without any apparent warning. And Trump declassified the footage in order to show us, and here's what we saw. You see a couple of people moving on the boat. It's a pretty close-up picture. It's just going through the water. And you're about to see very shortly, there's a more distant visual of the boat, and then something, either a helicopter, according to the U.S. government, dropping a bomb, or a drone dropping a bomb, quite a significant bomb, blows the boat into pieces out of water and sets it on fire. Clearly all the people on the boat died. And the Trump administration's claim was, and you'll notice in Trump's language, it's very deliberate. It's clearly vetted by lawyers, and it's intended to provide the legal justification for this strike. He uses the term terrorist multiple times. Now, the term terrorism has a lot of significance in our discourse. It's used constantly, not just for propagandistic purposes or to demonize, but also to justify legally all sorts of actions. But it's really a term that has no real meaning, which is what makes it such a valuable propagandistic term. It just gets applied to whoever the government wants it to apply it to. There's no criterion for it. There's no criteria for it. There's no metrics for it. At one point, it used to mean threatening or using violence against civilian populations with the goal of fostering political change. But Tren de Aragua doesn't even remotely do that. They're not interested in political change. They're not interested in threatening violence against civilians. They're interested in, if the government's claims are correct, in profiteering. They're a drug trafficking gang. They're looking to profit through the sale of drugs, something that drug traffickers have been doing for as long as drugs have existed. What does that have to do with terrorism? The reason it's important for Trump to call them terrorists is because there is no legal authority for Trump to just decide to blow up whatever boats he wants to blow up in the middle of the ocean in international waters. The only conceivable authorization there is legally for him to do that are the authorization to use military force that was enacted by the Congress in the wake of 9/11. That authorized U.S. military force against first Al-Qaeda and any groups that were associated with Al-Qaeda. And there's been a lot of efforts to try and repeal that based on the concern that at some point presidents will just start using it for any kind of bombing, any kind of wars they want to start. And they'll just call them terrorists and they'll say, oh, look, I have this authorization to use military force passed back in 2001 in the wake of the war on terror. And as long as I call someone a terrorist, it means that I get to blow them up. Now, the reality is the UAMF that was passed in 2001 was quite narrow. It only authorized the use of military force against the group that perpetrated the 9/11 attack, which we were told was Al-Qaeda, and any groups affiliated with it. But then it just stayed around for so long that it basically became carte blanche, like a blank check for first the Bush administration, then the Obama administration, then the Trump administration, to just bomb anyone in the Middle East, even if they had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. And say, oh yeah, we're bombing because we're attacking terrorists. Sometimes, even like in Syria, for example, we fought on the same side as Al-Qaeda. We were fighting to remove the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and so was Al-Qaeda. We were allies with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and we would just bomb Syria. And it's like, well, what justification do you have to bomb Syria? Oh, we have this authorization to use military force. But that was supposed to be against Al-Qaeda. You're fighting on the same side as Al-Qaeda. But it got stretched beyond recognition to justify bombing all throughout the Middle East. And a lot of people have said, hey, we should repeal this. The war on terror is over. And it never got repealed because once the Congress gives itself or the government power, it almost never gets taken away. Remember, the Patriot Act was supposed to be temporary. That was going to be repealed when we no longer needed it. And now it's just a permanent part of our government. Nobody ever talks about repealing it. And so Trump is basically trying to say this is a terrorist group like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and the congressional authorization for me to use military force against terrorism means that as long as I call someone a terrorist, I can now bomb them and go to war. And that's how Tren de Aragua went from being a drug trafficking gang to being a terrorist group. I mean, does Tren de Aragua sound like, based on everything even that the government says about it, if you want to believe it, like what terrorism is supposed to represent is a term? When have they threatened to use violence or use violence against civilians as a means of fostering political change. That's not what they're about, even remotely. But who cares? Terrorism is a word that means whatever the wielder of it wants it to mean, and it, according to the Trump administration, even allows it to just basically start a war by just bombing speedboats in the middle of the ocean. There's other claims in what Trump said that are extremely important. He said Nicaragua is controlled by Nicolas Maduro. Very similar to how liberals were saying that the hacking of the 2016 election was controlled by Vladimir Putin, or that Saddam Hussein was responsible for the 9/11 attack because he was in an alliance with Al-Qaeda. Where is there any evidence that Nicolas Maduro controls or directs this terrorist group? Obviously, they're trying to say that because what they want to do, and I hope you can see this, it's as clear as day, this is not about drugs coming to the United States. The drugs that come into the United States don't come principally from Venezuela at all. For years, we heard fentanyl was coming from China and Mexico, and cocaine comes from Colombia and Mexico. The U.S. government's own studies don't even mention Venezuela as a major source of drugs. This is not about drugs. That's the pretext. The real goal is to remove Maduro because he's the head of a very oil-rich country, doesn't allow access to the oil that Western oil companies want. Same old story as we've been doing for decades, just a continuation of the same foreign policy. And the US government wants to control Venezuela through a puppet, or wants to break it up into little pieces like we did in Syria and have militias fighting each other for our own interests, having nothing to do with Venezuelans or anything like that. And this is what all of this is about. But on top of that, there's also no evidence that there was any members of Nicaragua on this boat. If that's something you want to believe, and I can't tell you how many people I heard today, Trump supporters, insisting that as usual, not as usual, as always, what Trump did was right, because this was Nicaragua delivering drugs to the United States. There was zero evidence. Where is the evidence? Do you need any evidence at all before you believe that this was Nicaragua on these boats, on this boat? No evidence that they were heading to the United States to deliver these drugs. In fact, as we said, Marco Rubio's initial statement said that it was heading to Trinidad. Why would you use a tiny little boat, go from all the way from Venezuela to the United States? It's not easy on such a small little speedboat to get there. It's easy to get to Trinidad, which is much closer. So there's all these claims being made that have absolutely no evidence attached to them, accompanying them, just assertions from political leaders, knowing that followers of politicians like to believe whatever they say without any evidence. That's how wars are so easily started always. But they have major, major implications. I mean, if what Trump said is true, that Nicolas Maduro is the head of a terrorist organization and is a terrorist, of course the Trump administration is going to assert that it has authority to go to war with Venezuela. It doesn't need Congress, doesn't need anything. I mean, if Maduro was a terrorist, they're going to use that authorization to use military force against terrorists to justify anything they do to Venezuela. Here's the New York Times story on this from earlier today. Trump says U.S. attacked a boat carrying Venezuelan gang members, killing 11. Quote, President Trump said on Tuesday that the United States had carried out a strike against a boat carrying drugs and killed 11, quote, terrorists. The administration's latest military escalation in Mr. Trump's war against Venezuelan drug cartels that he is blamed for bringing fentanyl into the country. A senior U.S. official said a special operations aircraft, either an attack helicopter or an MQ-9 Reaper drone, carried out the attack on Tuesday morning against a 4-engine speedboat loaded with drugs. U.S. surveillance aircraft and other sensors had been monitoring cartel maritime traffic for weeks before the strike, said the official, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss operation details. A second U.S. official, who also was speaking on a condition of anonymity, said there would be more such attacks against cartel boats. The action comes amid a major buildup of U.S. naval forces outside Venezuela's waters. The administration has also stepped up belligerent rhetoric about fighting drug cartels and labeled Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, a terrorist cartel leader. Quote, the president is very clear that he's going to use the full power of America, the full might of the United States, to take on and eradicate these drug cartels, no matter where they're operating from, and no matter how long they've been able to act with impunity, said Secretary of State Marco Rubio before boarding a plane in Florida to head to Mexico. This is a question I genuinely have at this point. And I'm somebody who had believed, and in some cases still believe, that MAGA officials, MAGA influencers, MAGA pundits genuinely find neoconservative ideology to be destructive and are opposed to it. But leave them aside and let's look at the actions of the Trump administration and what they're saying. We're fighting terrorism. We have to just bomb whatever boats we think are terrorists, filled with terrorists, kind of like Obama bombing wedding parties because he said terrorists were there. So often turned out to be false. We just blew up civilians and wedding parties. We're fighting against terror. How is this remotely different from 2002, 2003 neocon ideology, neocon rhetoric, neocon discourse, neocon mentality, neocon legal justifications? What is the objections at this point that MAGA has to Bush-Cheney neoconservatism? I really don't see them. Especially since, as we're about to show you, what they're doing in Venezuela is basically a verbatim copy of what the first George Bush, former CIA director, ultimate deep state representative, did in Panama to justify the 1989 invasion of Panama, where we went to war with Panama, killed thousands of Panamanians, bombed Panama, and did so based on the claim that the president of Panama, Manuel Noriega, a longtime U.S. ally in the past, had turned into a terrorist and a drug trafficker, and we needed to go and change the government of Panama in order to arrest him and bring him to the United States to stand trial, which the United States then did, another glorious regime change war in Panama. Congratulations to the U.S. And all the same language used by the Bush administration then to do that is exactly what's being used now. So I need someone to tell me, who's a MAGA adherent, who supports this, what is the problem that you had with neoconservatism? Was it that it wasn't militaristic enough? Here was Marco Rubio's original claim before Trump came out and claimed the boat was headed to the United States to deliver drugs, where Marco Rubio said something much different.
The president made the announcement and said it was a lethal strike. I think the Pentagon will have more details and other things to offer you here in the next few hours, hopefully.
So what kind of vessel it was? Yeah, vessel.
The drug vessel. It was carrying drugs.
Size?
I'll refer you to the Pentagon. They'll give you more details on that when in the next, I anticipate shortly, probably while we're in the air.
How many deaths with the lethal force?
Again, look, I'm trying to be evasive. I'll let the Pentagon answer that. Suffice it to say that the president is going to be on offense against drug cartels and drug trafficking in the United States. It destabilizes not just the country, but the entire Caribbean basin. These particular drugs were probably headed to Trinidad or some other country in the Caribbean, at which point they just contribute to the instability of these countries.
This boat was headed toward Trinidad or some other country in the Caribbean. And he said it destabilizes the Caribbean. He didn't even pretend that this boat was carrying drugs to the United States or to Americans. And then Trump decided to come out and just say that, and then Marco Rubio retroactively changed his story. Did he actually not know that? Did Marco Rubio not know? I mean, he was the one, he's the Secretary of State. He was sent out to announce it and to explain it. And he said very explicitly this boat was headed to Trinidad or some other Caribbean island. And then Trump comes out and says, no, it was headed to the United States. We're going to drop drugs for Americans. Does that not raise any doubts or skepticism at all? Like, I don't know, is the government telling the truth, given how often they've not told the truth? Does it raise any skepticism that the justifications were leaked to the New York Times through anonymous U.S. officials in the same way that every program of government deceit involving war and everything else has been leaked? Not attached to any name, but just to anonymous claims that the New York Times mindlessly prints with no skepticism? Here's a report from the Drug Enforcement Agency, which is the federal government agency charged with being the ultimate authority on drug trafficking internationally and domestically. This is from 2024. It's the most recent report. And this is their annual report on cocaine. Venezuela is not even mentioned in this report. So now we're supposed to believe in 2025, when it's time to regime change Venezuela, that, oh, it's Venezuela dumping huge amounts of cocaine into the United States. Except here was the 2024 report, and it said this, quote, Colombia was identified as the primary source of U.S. seized cocaine analyzed through the CSP, approximately 84% of U.S. samples were classified as originating from Colombian coca. 84% of cocaine entering the United States comes from Colombia. The predominant sub-regional source of U.S. samples was southwestern Colombia, identified in approximately 42% of samples. Cocaine from Peruvian coca was identified in approximately 4% of U.S. samples. So Venezuela wasn't even, nobody even pretended that they were a major source of drugs. And as far as fentanyl was concerned, there's zero evidence this boat had fentanyl on it. We've heard for years that the main source of fentanyl is China and Mexico, that it comes through Mexico from China, that it's China flooding our country with fentanyl. Why isn't Trump blowing up boats coming from China that are supposedly delivering fentanyl to the United States? It's because we're not interested in regime change in China. President Trump loves President Xi. He heaps praise on him all the time. He talks about how great of a relationship they have. There's less antagonism toward China now than there certainly was under the Obama administration. This is all a pretext to do regime change in Venezuela. This is the WMD of Venezuela. This is the Benghazi and the no-fly zone that Obama invoked to regime change in Libya. Do you not see this? Our drug problem doesn't emanate from Venezuela. Really, it emanates from the fact that so many Americans want to do drugs and get addicted to drugs. We ought to ask the question of why that is. And the idea that we're just going to go around bombing random boats that we suspect to have drugs as a way of preventing the United States from being flooded with drugs, this is lunacy. Now, as I said, this is not the first time that the Trump administration tried to engineer regime change in Venezuela. It happened as well in the first Trump term. Here from NBC News, July 22nd, former National Security Advisor John Bolton admits to planning foreign coups. Pressed about his involvement, Bolton cited an unsuccessful attempt to oust Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro during the Trump administration. Here's Marco Rubio when he was a senator from Florida, from Miami in particular, where they're fanatical about regime change in these countries that are of interest to them because of their origin, not because they're related to U.S. interests. In April of 2019, which was, of course, the second to last year of the Trump administration, and he tweeted this, quote, "Just saw CNN shamefully call what is happening today in Venezuela a, quote, coup attempt. Juan Guaido is recognized as the legitimate interim president of Venezuela by a constitution, over 50 countries, and the OAS. The only coup is the one carried out by Cuba in support of dictator Maduro." So the attempted coup of the United States was not trying to install somebody never elected named Juan Guaido, a Western puppet, as president of Venezuela. No, the coup was somehow what Cuba did in Venezuela. Here from Axios in April of 2021, they say the coup actually came close to succeeding in the first Trump administration. The day Maduro almost fell. The inside story of a failed uprising. Quote, "John Bolton's day began with a 5:25 a.m. phone call from the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. By then it was clear to both officials that, quote, this was the day." Bolton tells Axios, for the first time in his tenure as National Security Advisor, Bolton woke Donald Trump. He relayed the message that Guaido was putting his plan to split the regime and oust Maduro into action, and that the day could end with either Venezuelan leader imprisoned. And it's in the early afternoon, by which time the situation had, quote, taken a dip downhill, Bolton emerged in front of the White House and shocked the international media by declaring that Padrino, Moreno, and Ivan Hernandez Dala, the head of the Presidential Guard, had all conspired against Maduro. Quote, "I just want everyone to be sure that we know what was going on, that we knew that the people in the Maduro regime had been taking part of this plot," Bolton says. "The regime insiders never fully trusted the opposition's promises. The military was only going to to side with the winning team, and Maduro kept his cool, the source who was coordinating between the sides say. One by one, the regime's top figures took their places behind Maduro. The following morning, Padrino was on state TV, smiling alongside his commander-in-chief. So the whole thing ended up to be a failure. The obvious comparison here is to what George Bush 41 did in Panama. Here is from the United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York in March of 2020. Manhattan U.S. Attorney announces narco-terrorism charges against Nicolas Maduro, current and former Venezuelan officials, and the FARC leadership. William Barr, the Attorney General of the United States, Jeffrey Berman, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, announced the unsealing of two separate indictments charging current and former Venezuelan officials and FARC leadership. One superseding indictment includes narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, and weapons charges against Maduro. The U.S. Department of State, through its narcotics reward program, is now offering rewards of up to $15 million for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Maduro. And they increased that subsequently this month to $50 million. Here from CBS News, August 7th. Trump doubles Nicolas Maduro bounty offers, $50 million reward for arrest of Venezuela's president. So you see what's happening. They want to remove Nicolas Maduro from power and control a country of great importance to Marco Rubio's constituency in South Florida and to Marco Rubio himself. This has nothing to do with American interest. Regime change wars in Venezuela, like the regime change war that Bush 41 did in Panama, has nothing to do with the lives of the American people. It's about controlling this region for the same interest as we always fight wars for. Now, Rubio has been calling Maduro has long been calling Maduro a fugitive from justice, which obviously means that the U.S. believes it has the right to go and capture him and bring him back to the U.S. And this is it's a complete replica of what happened with the U.S. war in Panama, this completely senseless, stupid war. Many of you might not remember, but when George Bush 41 was elected, there was this very common theme that he had this wimp energy, unlike the great, powerful Ronald Reagan. Even though Ronald Reagan avoided war, was an actor, while George H.W. Bush was a genuine war hero in World War II, and then ran the CIA. But somehow it was Reagan who was like this strong, courageous military leader, even though he never got near a war. Whereas George H.W. Bush, who actually risked his life and came close to dying and was an actual war hero in World War II, was somehow the wimp. And they wanted a war quickly so that he could lose this wimp status. And they picked Panama to invade because why not? It's like Reagan invaded Grenada. You just pick a country, just kind of invade it, show the U.S. means business, whatever. And the New York Times actually ran a front page story saying no more wimp factor for George H.W. Bush now that he invaded Panama. And the rationale used to invade Panama and do regime change there, here from the New York Times, September 1st, 1989, which is 36 years ago, even though it could be today. U.S. renews attacks on Noriega, offering evidence of ties to drugs. Quote, in a new effort to turn world opinion against General Manuel Antonio Noriega, the United States asserted today that the Panamanian strongman continued to play a major role in the laundering of drug money and the shipment of narcotics through his country. The Bush administration also said the general had built a personal fortune of $200 million to $300 million, mainly through drug trafficking and other national criminal activities. Deputy Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, addressing a special session of the Organization of American States, presented a catalog of evidence to support accusations that General Noriega had turned Panama into, quote, a haven for drug traffickers. They just recycle these scripts every 20 to 30 years. People don't remember them. They seem new. People get all riled up. They're like, yeah, get the terrorists, kill the drug traffickers. And that's how we end up in endless war. Here from the Washington Post, December of 1989, Noriega's CIA ties complicated the decision. Quote, the 1988 indictments of General Manuel Antonio Noriega used by the Bush administration to justify efforts to capture and arrest the Panamanian leader, climaxed an intense debate within the U.S. government on the unprecedented legal, diplomatic, and national security issues raised by bringing criminal charges against a foreign leader who had once had a close relationship with the U.S. intelligence agencies. Noriega's long-standing association with the CIA, the DEA, and other branches of the U.S. government continues to haunt the case, current and former U.S. officials said yesterday, meaning maybe the CIA and the DEA itself have been involved in drug trafficking before. And we're perfectly happy to support Noriega. And then for geopolitical reasons, when it wanted to remove him, cited his drug trafficking status, even though he was in bed with the CIA and the DIA doing exactly that for a long time. By the way, the code name, the phrase given to that invasion was Operation Just Cause. And here is George H.W. Bush losing his wimp status by sending people in the United States to war in Panama, announcing at the White House why we were doing this.
Nevertheless, his apprehension and return to the United States should send a clear signal that the United States is serious in its determination that those charged with promoting the distribution of drugs cannot escape the scrutiny of justice. The return of General Noriega marks a significant milestone in Operation Just Cause.
Now, can I ask you a question? We did this because we were showing the world we meant business. That we were not going to tolerate international drug traffickers into our country. How did that work? Did drugs dry up in the United States? Did drug addiction problems go away? Did we end the war on drugs that put millions of Americans into prison cells based on nonviolent drug offenses? Is that what happened? I don't think it worked very well, if that were actually the goal. So why 35 years later are people willing to believe that that's actually the reason that we think we're going to end the problem of towns being overwhelmed with drug addiction by taking out some tiny little Latin American country that isn't even the source of most or even close to most of the drugs entering the United States, while completely ignoring the actual reasons why so many Americans end up addicted to drugs? Although this was a dumb, easy, pointless war, it was actually quite a destructive one. From the LA Times, October 1990, the title of which was Invasion Ghosts, Panama tries to bury rumors of mass graves. Allegations persist that up to 4,000 civilians were killed in the U.S. invasion. Quote, some in Panama and the United States insist that as many as 4,000 Panamanians died in the fighting, most of them civilians. There are allegations of mass graves throughout the country where U.S. soldiers intent on a cover-up dumped the bodies of victims. The official casualty estimates of the U.S. Southern Command is that 515 Panamanians were killed. Of those, 202 were civilians and 51 members of the Panamanian military. The rest could not be classified because many Panamanian soldiers were in civilian clothes, and others, members of irregular military units called dignity battalions, had no uniforms, U.S. sources said. Oh, they used human shields. Whatever. The independent, respected Panamanian Committee for Human Rights said its investigation showed that a total of 565 Panamanians died. An extensive investigation in the spring by the U.S. Physicians for Human Rights came up with similar figures. So for sure, we're going to kill a bunch of people. Who knows how many? Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, whatever. We just have to make sure we have the governments in place of these countries that we want instead of the ones that the people in that country want. Or even if they don't want it, we just do regime change if we think that we feel like doing it. And this is the road we're on, so don't deceive yourself. And if you're going to deceive yourself that, it's really about drugs, please have skepticism when Donald Trump and Marco Rubio and the rest of these people make claims that you're supposed to believe, even though they're showing you no evidence for it, or it's being leaked to the New York Times by anonymous officials. I hope I don't even have to say why that warrants so much skepticism. We did see this before in April when Trump decided that he was going to reinitiate and escalate Joe Biden's campaign of bombing Yemen, which, by the way, Donald Trump condemned when Biden was doing it, said it was unnecessary, he gets into office. He's like, hey, I'd like to bomb Yemen too. And he went on X, Donald Trump did, and he showed a really cool video of 40 Yemenis, maybe 60, standing around in what looks like kind of a prayer circle or a tribal circle. And he posted this video. There you see it on the screen. They were standing there, and the United States was just like, your lives are over. We just bombed you. And Trump claimed, quote, these Houthis gathered for instructions on an attack. Oops, there will be no attack by these Houthis. They will never sink our ships again. Why would the Houthis, knowing the United States was bombing their country, constantly monitoring them, constantly surveilling them, just stand out in the open in a big, huge circle? And why would Trump supporters believe when he just asserts with no evidence that, oh, they were planning attacks on U.S. ships? There was plenty of evidence to believe that this is a common tribal Yemeni prayer practice. They weren't even armed. It was traditional practices of the kind that Yemenis engage in. There you can see an up-close picture of other similar types of prayers where they're in the exact same formation. But Trump said, oh, we obliterated terrorists, and a bunch of Trump supporters, no evidence needed, like, yeah, get the terrorists, as though they were Dick Cheney or Liz Cheney in 2002. Leading me again to question, like, what is the difference at this point between the MAGA movement as it exists in power, not how it presented itself during the campaign, but as it exists in power, versus the 2002, 2003 neocons that we were told MAGA was so violently and vehemently opposed to? What is the difference? Finally, just to underscore the point before we get to a very patient and Zen-like Michael Tracy, who's waiting to speak with us about various events that happened yesterday and his other work relating to Epstein. Just to underscore the point, just before we went on air, it was announced that the Department of Defense is going to undergo a name change, not because Congress is changing its name, which is how agencies have in the past had their name changed. Like it used to be called the HUD, what was it? HUD was, it had a name change. It used to be of urban development, and also the Health and Human Services agency also had a name change, all done through Congress. Trump wants to change the name of the Department of Defense back to its original name, which was the Department of War, which I guess is more honest because the reason it changed from Department of War to Department of Defense was because if it was really just the Department of War, we weren't supposed to need it at all times. We're not supposed to be in permanent war. So they changed it to Department of Defense to say, no, what this is really about is defending our country. So we need a permanent cabinet ministry for that. But now it's going to be called the Department of War again, according to Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump, a much more honest name for this agency. That is what this agency does. It doesn't defend the United States. Venezuela is not attacking the United States. Yemen wasn't attacking the United States. You go on with all these wars that we fought that weren't about defending the United States. It is actually a Department of War. That's what it is. And Pete Hegseth seems very excited by this. He's going to have a really cool name change. He's not going to be the Department of the Secretary of Defense anymore. It's like a soft, woke, gay name. He has a much cooler name, way more badass, Department of War. So here you see Fox News exclusive. White House reveals it will bring back the Department of War name for the Department of Defense. And Pete Hegseth went on X and above that in all caps wrote, Department of War. I mean, the excitement is palpable. He's going to be the Secretary of War. And this is the direction that Trump foreign policy is clearly headed in. We bombed 7, 8 countries. We're on our way to a regime change war in Venezuela, something that neocons and the Marco Rubios of the world have long dreamed of. Our next guest, Michael Tracy, once said, the safest bet where you'll never go broke is if you simply bet on the continuation of bipartisan foreign policy, no matter what the outcome of elections are, no matter what the candidates say. In this case, you could almost say it's not really even a continuation of bipartisan foreign policy. It's really quite an intense escalation, both in terms of the theories they're embracing, the rhetoric that they're spouting, and the actions they're taking to continuously finance and arm multiple wars and fight and bomb multiple other countries as well. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.